What's up guys? Welcome back to the channel Hand Waving. Your friend Naruto Addict 2.0 is here again with a brand new Naruto fanfic that's going to change everything. A story where Naruto is betrayed and banished. But destiny has bigger plans for him. From exile to emperor, this is the journey of power, strategy, and love. Today's fanfic is titled, What If Naruto Altered Fate Through Sakura's Bloodline? Part 1. Sarada felt a burning on her cheeks and a thudding in her chest. She was going to walk with the Hokage today to discuss her father. Her mom had put this off for a while, but now that Sarada was older and able to understand the world a little bit more, Sarada insisted and insisted over and over again for her mom to just tell her, but Sakura did not want her daughter to be brought into the light about everything her father had done in his life. Sakura left things to Naruto to explain that Sakura, herself, didn't quite get. Sarada paced in front of the Uzumaki house. She was told to report there at 5 p.m. sharp. She wondered what on earth the Hokage could tell her that she didn't already figure out herself, or was told by her mom. Sarada. Hinata called from the front door. Come in. He is well. He is always running late, isn't he? She blushed at her words. Addressing the Hokage like that. I don't want to intrude, Lady Hinata. Sarada could not deny that she longed to step into that home, but she also knew her place. No worries. Himawari and Boruto are out, and I just hate for you to stand out there waiting on the Hokage. Hinata waved for Sarada to come up the steps. Sarada followed the gesture and walked up the steps. She found herself in the doorway and Hinata had already disappeared into the other room. Sarada looked around curiously. I am just cleaning up the kitchen. Please make yourself at home. He should be finishing up soon in the back. I told him that you were here already. Hinata's voice carried through the beautiful home. She breathed in deeply and could smell the faint ramen remnants. She smiled thinking about how much the Hokage loved ramen. She glanced at the hook by the door where Naruto hung his Hokage cloak and hat. She smiled thinking about how handsome he looked wearing that cloak. The warmth on her cheeks returned. She looked around to try and take her mind off her thoughts of him. She walked slowly in the home, taking every sight and detail in. She never would have thought she would find herself in the Uzumaki home. Sarada. The Hokage's voice filled her ears. Ready? Yeah, she said automatically. Okay, let's go. Naruto turned to the kitchen and beckoned his wife over. We will get going. If you hear from Sakura, just tell her we will be back before it's too late. He licked his bottom lip, eager for his wife to kiss him. Hinata smiled, embarrassed by his behavior. Oh Hinata, he chuckled. Sarada gulped down the dryness in her throat. She had realized her eyes were fixed on Naruto, and as soon as he licked his bottom lip she almost let out a noise from her throat. She always found Naruto attractive in a grown man, mentor, teacher kind of way, but today she was catching herself being awkward about it, and even a little more lustful. She turned her head quickly and just tried to focus on another part of the room. For the next minute or so all Sarada could imagine was Naruto's tongue touching his bottom lip, practically begging for his wife to kiss him. Sarada shifted on her feet and tried not to think about it, but his blonde hair and whiskered cheeks filled her mind. Okay. He playfully smiled. No kiss, at least hug me. He held his arms open, and Hinata hugged him, but Naruto shifted his body so all Sarada could see was his back. She found her eyes looking over him again. She loved how he looked fit, but not too much muscle. She found her mind drifting again. She bit her lip and forced herself to start walking towards the door, and wait patiently for the Hokage. She hoped her cheeks didn't give away the way she was feeling. Bye, and Sarada, feel free to put him in his place if he needs it. Hinata sounded stern, but she had a smile on her face as well. Hinata knew the kind of guy Naruto was. Yes, Lady Hinata. Sarada spoke respectfully. She felt a tingle in her spine as she thought about putting Naruto in his place. Those words were quickly taken out of context in her mind. The Hokage and Sarada started walking, and most of the walk felt awkward to both of them. Naruto was not quite sure what to talk about. He usually left the diplomacy and stuff to everyone else. He never wanted Sarada, Sasuke, or Sakura to feel disconnected from him though. He placed both hands behind his head and walked casually. He decided to wear his Hokage cloak, but leave the hat at home. That hat seemed silly to him anyways. Everyone in the Leaf Village knew who he was. He wanted to make Sarada to feel like she got answers she wanted or needed about her dad. He knew what it was like to not have a dad. He glanced at her as they walked. Sarada had a slightly quicker pace than him, and he took advantage of that to take in just how grown up she was now. He smiled at the thought of his two best friends residing in this young lady. She looked so grown up now, and Naruto caught himself looking over the curves of her body. He couldn't help but notice the curve of her back, and the way her hips moved so perfectly as she took her quick-paced steps. Sarada wasn't sure where exactly they were going, but continued on the road. She figured if there was any change in direction, he would let her know. She could feel his gaze on her. She wondered if he was checking her out or just checking on her. She slowly turned her eyes to him, and her dark eyes met his brilliant blue eyes, and they both blushed deep red. Sarada looked straight ahead now. Does that mean he was checking me out? What does this mean? Wait, it's just a guy thing, right? Mom says that guys cannot help it sometimes. Oh, great, now I am thinking about my mom's lectures. Oh. Let's go this way. Naruto smiled and pointed to the right. There was a small street that led off to a building of old living quarters. Sure. Sarada didn't question him. She just followed. I know how lonely you must feel sometimes, Sarada. Naruto led her up some steps, and into a living space. You know, I never had my parents growing up, and the hardest things in life I had to learn on my own without the guidance of a father, and the only times I ever saw my parents, it wasn't really them. Naruto pointed to a couch and nodded. This is Shikamaru's and my space away from the office. Sometimes it's too much to be stuck in that office. There is no one that knows about this place except him, and you now. He shut the door behind her once she entered the living space. And me. She had been listening to everything he said, but it all sort of faded away when she found herself in a little hideout of the Hokages all alone with her. Well, yes. He grinned. Sit down. Don't be rude. He gestured to the couch again. I want you to have a safe place to come to if you ever need to talk or just get away. Huh. Sarada slowly sat down and adjusted her glasses that slipped down her nose slightly. Sarada, life is hard, and I know the kind of person your mom is. I thought I loved her for a long, long time. He sat down next to Sarada, and his hands rested on her shoulders and he smiled brightly. And Sasuke, well, your dad just needed more of his own dad, I am sure. Your family is broken, and if there is anyone in this village that understands broken families, it is me. But, Sarada was still lost. She was swimming in confusion, but also staring in his big blue eyes. He was touching her and they were alone and no one knew where they were. Naruto smirked and removed his hands. Well then, you are at an age now where you can understand things better, and have grown up enough to make choices of your own. You can make your own opinions and piece together what you already know or think you know with what you don't know. You are rather smart, like your mom and dad. Naruto's eyes gazed up at the ceiling and he leaned back on the couch with his hands behind his head. Thanks, Hokage. Sarada spoke quietly. She wondered why Naruto was going out of his way for her. She knew he had been without his parents and that many people shunned him and refused to even talk to him about his family. She looked at him stretch his body out and close his eyes. She had never seen him so relaxed. Was this like a test, or a technique he was using to catch her off guard? Sarada stared at his face feeling confused. Naruto sighed. 16, you know it feels like so long ago for me, and yet it feels like just yesterday. My mom told me you didn't become Gen until you were 17. Sarada still stared at his face. Her eyes gazed at his whiskers, then moved to his lips. She felt a burning in her tummy imagining him licking his lip at her the same way he did earlier in the day to his wife. Oh damn Sarada, what are you thinking? Oh Sakura. He chuckled. Well, you do know I saved the village, a lot. He said in a beat that sort of tone. Sarada let out a small laugh. Of course, I knew that. Uzumaki, Naruto, Legend of the Hidden Leaf, and our seventh Hokage. Damn right, Sarada, he said proudly. Sarada, I want you to know you can always come to me if you have any questions about your dad, or if you need to talk about anything. He opened one eye and peeked at her. She blushed brightly because she was still looking at him. Sarada smiled, looking down at her lap. This must be where Naruto goes to get away from everything, his safe place to think about life and everything. Before she really had time to register what happened next, she found Naruto's arms wrapped around her, and her ear pressed against his chest. She almost let out a longing sigh, but held it in tightly. She had never really had a male figure in her life to talk to, or even get close to, and now she has not just the Hokage, but Naruto Uzumaki. Her heart pounded in her chest as she felt his heartbeat in her ear. Sarada gulped, hoping that Naruto wouldn't realize she was infatuated with him. She inhaled deeply as the scent of Naruto filled her senses. Sarada felt as though she could live in this moment forever. She would never forget this feeling. As he released the hug, he smiled at her and stood up. Well then, if you want we can call it a day or we can stay and talk, what do you think? Sarada's mind seemed to drown in the idea of Naruto Uzumaki even taking a moment out of his day to speak with her. Sarada spent weeks and weeks thinking of a reason to go to him for advice, guidance, or any reason outside needing a mission. She paced in her room. She could not help but think of the way he relaxed in front of her. She sighed and sat on her bed. As she closed her eyes and bit her lip, the sight of the Hokage stretched out next to her filled her mind. Her senses tingled with his presence. She could remember the smell of his cloak, and the warmth of his body. She groaned impatiently at herself. What on earth was she going to do about these feelings? No one in the village would understand. She could never go to her mom with advice. She tapped her fingers impatiently on her lap and let out another sigh and stood up. She found herself acting so silly over something that she felt was not worth the fuss. Everything seems normal enough. Girls get infatuation with teachers, and their senseis all the time. How could this be any different? Sarada stood up and adjusted her glasses. Everything was normal as could be. It had been a solid 2 months since she had been alone with Naruto, and everything was fine. Sarada left her home and went to meet Konohamaru down at their usual meeting place. As she stepped lightly on her feet, she looked towards the living quarters that many shinobis and students used when they had no homes to live in. She wondered if Naruto was there now, and if he was, might he be alone, or was he having a moment out of the office with Shikamaru? Sarada turned her eyes to the road before her, and she tried not to think about the way Naruto licked his lip when attempting to get his wife to kiss him goodbye. Another week went by and Sarada still found herself longing to be in the presence of the Hokage, and to smell his cloak once again. She stood outside the Hokage's building and looked in thought. She was thinking how silly she was acting. Her mom had sent her to deliver a scroll for the medical corp. Sarada wanted to deliver it, but now she felt doubt that she could do it without making a fool of herself. Sarada finally picked up the nerve and entered the building. For late afternoon it seemed kind of quiet inside. She always expected everyone to be rushing around trying to get last-minute things done before they left for the day. She knew the 7th was always busy and often resorted to sending shadow clones home in his absence. That she knew because Boruto complained all too often that his old man was a bad father. Sarada could understand maybe the frustration, but at least Boruto had a father in the village. Who knows where her father is and if he is okay. Stopping at the famous office door of the Hokages, Sarada told herself to keep it together. No blushing, by now people had to have noticed, especially Hokage himself. Sarada lifted her hand to knock, but right as she did the door opened and she almost knocked on Shikamaru's face. So sorry, she quickly lowered her hand and smiled nervously at the shadow ninja. Oh, we were not expecting to see you. Shikamaru glanced over at Naruto, who was standing with his forehead pressed against the window and eyes staring widely at the view of the Leaf Village. It is a scroll from my mom. It should only take a moment of the Hokage's time. Sarada didn't look too long at Naruto, but rather focused on Shikamaru. Moms can be troublesome and wait till the last minute to do things. Shikamaru nodded and jabbed his thumb in the air toward Naruto. He's just about done for the day. Don't keep him too long. I have promised to meet Ino and Choji for our weekly barbecue. Yeah, okay, Sarada nodded and let Shikamaru pass by. Sarada walked in the office and heard the click of the door closing and assumed that was Shikamaru closing the door. Sir. She politely stood at the desk trying not to overthink what he could possibly be doing with his head against the window pane. My mom wanted me to leave you this scroll. She said it's not urgent, but she didn't want to put it off and forget all about it. Yeah, she felt uneasy. Sarada. Naruto removed his forehead from the window pane and turned his back from her. Yes. Okay. She found herself without words. Is that all? He turned to her with a crooked smile. Well, Sarada was fighting for words. She didn't want to leave, but she couldn't think of any reason to say, well, any appropriate reason to stay. Naruto bowed his head. I understand. He walked to his chair and sat down. It seems I misjudged you. What? Sarada looked lost. Well, you see, I thought for sure by now you might have needed the guidance of a male adult in your life. I thought you would really take me up on the offer of confiding in me about internal struggles you might be having involving Sasuke, your dad. Naruto gave her a serious look. Sarada did not know what to say, because once again she found herself lost in his bright blue eyes, and she could feel her cheeks get warm. It isn't that at all, Sarada began but lost her words. How could she have lost her words? She has always seemed to know what to say, and when to say it. Strong like Sakura. Naruto smiled at her and leaned in his chair a little. I do wish to be alone with you. I mean, well, that is, I want to talk to you about stuff, it's just I don't know how, or when, or what to do. She hoped Naruto wouldn't have heard the first part of that. Sarada. Naruto stood up. Whenever you need me, all you have to do is let me know. Need me? Did he really just say? Need me? Tell you what. I will keep your missions clear for this week. Tomorrow meet me where I showed you at this time. I do have to be getting home though, so I hope you don't mind. Lady Hinata promised pork ramen if I made it home on time. Naruto grinned. Ramen? Yes, for ramen he would do anything. The word itself made him smile. Sarada nodded, waved bye to him. Ramen, she said, leaving the office. Next day. The next day seemed to drag on and on. Sarada found anxiousness again edging up from her stomach. She felt like she really could be sick. 2 p.m. came along, and once again she found herself arguing with Boruto. She really wondered if her mom was right in saying Boruto is just like his dad. I mean, really, how true can that be, especially when Boruto likes hamburgers and cannot stand ramen? Sarada raised her fist to Boruto's head and brought it down with so much force that Boruto fell to the ground groaning. You really don't learn a thing, do you? She ran off and found herself standing by the Yamanaka flower shop. She peered in and saw Ino and Sai. Sai was poking a big brightly colored flower and had a look of thought on his face. She stared to see what was going on. This should do. Sai smiled respectfully at Ino and bowed his head. Oh, Sai. Another painting challenge for Inojin. She lifted his chin with her hand and smiled. Hasn't Inojin proven worth to you thus far? Ino, you misunderstand. This is not what it seems. This will determine who cleans up tonight, and you, my sweet flower, shall be the judge. Sai made a smile and closed his eyes, delighted in the thought of Inojin and himself not fighting about talents anymore. You really would do that? She planted a kiss on his forehead. Sarada glanced away at some of the flowers on a shelf nearby. She felt a little twinge of pain in her heart. She thought about what kinds of things her and her dad could have done together around the house. Would she be more willing to help her mom if her dad was around to make it fun? Would both her and her dad ignore her mom's pleas to clean the dishes, or shake out the rugs? Oh, how she hated shaking out rugs. Sarada picked up a little flower pot that had a small orange flower barely starting to bloom. She smiled. Something about that flower seemed to stand out in her mind. Oh Sarada. Ino smiled and waved. Sarada looked away from the flower to look at Ino. Looking for something in particular. Ino spoke to Sarada as she turned to the flowers she had just brought into the shop. They needed a little grooming to prepare them to be placed in vases. Well, no, I was just looking. I actually have to go. Sarada waved to Ino, and Ino waved back with a cheerful, goodbye and come back anytime. Sarada walked past a market shop on her way to her rendezvous. She had thought about her dad some more. She wondered if he was the kind of dad that would be a workaholic, or the kind of dad that would put value in the time he spends with his family. She had the idea that her dad was to himself, not because anyone mistreated him or anything, but because it was his personal choice. He had a lot of things in his life he was determined to achieve, and he wasn't going to let anything distract him from his goal. Sarada. A pleasant and welcoming voice snuck up behind her. She was walking up the steps to the meeting place, and Naruto had been at her foot. Perfect timing, yes. Perfect. Of course, Sarada smiled. She reached the door and turned to look at Naruto. I would say from the look on your face, you've been thinking about something. Naruto opened the door and let Sarada enter first. He quickly shut the door and tapped the door hastily to lock it. I actually was. Sarada noted the door was locked now. She wasn't sure why it needed to be locked if no one else knew about it except Shikamaru, and if all they were doing was talking. Sarada awkwardly stood waiting for Naruto to tell her it was okay to sit down. Rather than telling her to sit down, he instead swooped into the small kitchen area and started looking for something to snack on. Sarada looked around with discomfort in her stomach. So, Naruto spoke to her. What is on your mind, Sarada? Sarada did not say anything, but instead walked to the kitchen area and watched Naruto poke his head in the cabinets above the counter. She could hear his hands pushing things around looking for something. She wondered how she would begin to explain herself to him. It wasn't that she was a shy or nervous person, but the man in the room just feet away from her was the leader of the Hidden Leaf Village. He is a man that's many years older than herself, this paired with the fact he is married and has a family. She groaned in her mind and made a face of discomfort. She was at the point now that she couldn't even bear to be around him without her mind going insane with desire and lustful thoughts. Oh! Naruto groaned in disappointment. He shut the cabinet door. He had intended on making some instant noodles, but there were none left. He started to walk to the living area, but as he stepped to the walkway he stopped suddenly. He saw Sarada's face and smiled. It's okay. He placed a hand on her shoulder. If you are not ready. Sarada's mind snapped back into focus and realized his hand was on her shoulder, and his bright eyes were looking into hers. She reached her hand up across her chest and placed it on Naruto's hand. She smiled at him. Naruto's smile turned into a foxy smirk. I get it. It's not easy to express. Naruto of course was speaking of her daddy issues, and yet Sarada was far from thinking of that problem. Her fingers wrapped around Naruto's fingers and she stepped closer to him. Naruto's smirk stayed, but he could feel something different in the moment. He could feel nervousness edging in, and a little bit of curiosity. Sarada, Naruto whispered. Sarada's eyes stayed fixed on his, and she made the final step to bring the both of them close enough that she could almost feel his body against her. She had no idea what he was going to do, but she had to do something. She took his hand from her shoulder and brought his fingers to her lips and lightly kissed his knuckles. Her eyes lowered to look at his skin. She was panicking on the inside. This moment could end horrifically. Naruto felt the warmth on her lips against his skin, and surge of electricity tingled down his spine. He found himself stuck in a moment of uncertainty. This teen that was obviously attractive had his fingers to her lips. He felt something deep within him tempt him to respond to Sarada with a sensual physical gesture. Naruto thought about how Sarada's cheeks would turn pink around him. He thought about the way they've awkwardly caught each other's eyes after checking each other out. This is why you haven't come back to see me. Naruto was calm as he spoke. He tried to think about what he should have said. Were those the right words to say? Naruto was never good with mature topics, and dealing with other people's emotions. Sarada merely nodded in response to his question. Naruto watched as Sarada's cheeks turned pink. She lowered both their hands, and let go of her hold on his fingers. Both of them let their hands rest at their sides as they looked into each other's eyes. I am not sure what the two of us should do about this, you know. Naruto's voice was almost a whisper. He could almost feel their bodies touching, and he found himself wanting to feel her touch again. Neither do I, Hokage. Sarada's closed her eyes and bit her lip, trying so hard to stay in the moment. She just wanted him to know that no matter what happened here, she wouldn't regret a second of it. Naruto raised his hand to her neck and caressed the soft skin along her jawline with his thumb. He watched this young lady biting her lip, torn between whether he should act on these feelings or not. He could see how much she wanted this moment in her eyes before she closed them. Sarada slightly turned her cheek to encourage Naruto that his was a good feeling. His thumb was now caressing her cheek. Naruto watched her face as he caressed her skin. He slowly moved his fingers down her neck. He brought his body close to hers. Their bodies now touching. Sarada released her lip and opened her eyes, and a smile crept across her face. Naruto could see the pleasure in her smile, and in her eyes. Her hands slowly found themselves moving to his sides. Naruto found himself getting caught up in the moment. The feeling of her body touching his, the look on her face, the feel of her encouraging him, and letting him know this is what she's wanted these past weeks. Naruto smirked, a very fox-like, a cheeky smirk. No one knows we are here, you know. His voice filled with mischief. Sarada's fingers grasped at the orange and black fabric beneath her fingers. She had no idea what to expect next, but she knew it was not going to be rejection. No one, she whispered. Well, you have to stop calling me Hokage, Naruto said as he removed his cloak and let it fall at their feet. Naruto, he instructed. But Sarada was caught off guard by the change in tone. Just when we are alone, he put his hands over hers and guided her fingers to pull his shirt up. Sarada followed his lead, and soon enough they both removed his shirt. His hands held hers and he watched her face as Sarada took a moment to look over the Hokage's torso. So, no more Hokage, just Naruto. Naruto smirked, waiting for her to look at his face, and when she did, she blushed again. Yes. She nodded at him. Naruto pulled her body close and leaned in to kiss her. Sarada felt so nervous, but so excited at the same time. This was the moment she had been daydreaming about. He let his lips lightly brush against hers and linger. Sarada parted her lips and lifted her chin to kiss him back. Both their lips parted and they stood kissing. Sarada found herself moving her hands up his bare torso. Naruto let out a groan against their kissing, which caused their kissing to become deeper. Naruto let his tongue brush her bottom lip, and then soon after their tongues were brushing against each other. Naruto felt his tummy burning with pleasure and lust. His body wanting more. He lightly bit her lip, and his hands found her hips. He slowly pulled her hips against his, and a muffled groan came from his lips once more. Sarada let out a noise of pleasure, feeling their bodies bump against one another. Sarada's hands now moved up Naruto's arms. Bed. Now. Naruto breathed lustfully, pulling his head up from their kissing. Bed. Sarada found this escalating quickly. She gulped down the anxiety that tried to surface. Naruto got that fox-like smirk again. Bed. He grabbed her hand and started to pull her towards the bedroom at the end of the hall. Sarada followed his motions, her heart pounding in her ear. Naruto's foxy smirk made Sarada even more excited. As they entered the room, Naruto sat at the foot of the bed and Sarada found herself again staring at him. She was taking in the sight of him, the smell of him, and everything about Naruto. The light in the room was not on, and the blinds were drawn over the window. It was darker in the room, but she still had no trouble seeing the fire in Naruto's blue eyes, and feeling that her body was drawn to him. Naruto. Sarada spoke slowly. She was not used to calling him by his name. She wouldn't even call him Naruto away from his presence either. It was a simple form of respect and authority. I have never, she began to admit to him that she had never been intimate with anyone before this afternoon. Naruto shook his head at her words, and licked his lips. Sarada stepped closer once more. She didn't finish her sentence. Never mind that, Sarada. Naruto leaned forward and grabbed her hands, and pulled her body to his, until Sarada stood between Naruto's legs. He guided her hands to rest on his shoulders. His hands made their way to her hips. His fingers crept under the hem of her shirt, stroking the skin beneath the fabric. She inhaled and exhaled deeply. Sarada stared into his eyes. She couldn't stop looking into his blue eyes, wondering what was going to happen next. She could feel lust, pleasure, excitement, and control. Her hands stayed on his shoulders, but she found her body wanting to touch him more and more. She looked down from his eyes, and down at how her body was positioned. She was practically in his lap. She looked at Naruto's hands disappear under the fabric of her shirt and slightly leaned her body toward Naruto to encourage him not to stop. Naruto moved his fingers out of her shirt, and eagerly moved his hands to the zipper of her shirt. He slowly unzipped her top, but Sarada grabbed his hands and pushed them slowly down. Naruto felt irritation at this gesture, but it quickly subsided when he heard her shirt unzip. He looked up at her, and sure enough, she had unzipped her own top. Sarada let her red top fall to the ground to reveal that she wore a black low-cut undertop, and a black plain bra underneath that. She felt a little more outgoing now that there was momentum to their situation. The awkwardness of it had started to fall away and leave her in a state of pleasure. Sarada bent down and placed her hands on his knees, and for a moment Naruto had a clear view of her chest, and how young and curved beautiful her body really turned out to be. He licked his bottom lip, eagerly begging Sarada to kiss her. Sarada smirked. Bed. That's what you said, right? She moved away from him only for Naruto to feel her body get on the bed. Naruto turned to her. He placed his hand on the bed, and crawled his way to her. Sarada leaned back so her head was on a pillow. Naruto stayed on all fours beside her, and he leaned down and kissed her lips. He parted his lips without hesitation, insisting on adding depth to their kissing. He moved a hand to her stomach and let his middle finger trace lightly the skin right along her hip bone. Sarada let out a noise of pleasure. Naruto's body shifted so that he was lying beside her with his body propped up by the arm and hand beneath him, while the other hand continued to move fingers along her skin. Now his fingers paused at the button to her shorts. His fingers were quick, and the button was undone. Naruto pulled out of the kiss and looked down at Sarada's body. He slowly pushed down her khaki shorts, and leaned down to place kissed along the skin of her chest that barely peeked out of her tight-fitting black undershirt. Sarada lifted her hips and used her hands to help Naruto free her lower body from the shorts. As Sarada's hips' lower back touched the bed again, Naruto's lips moved to her ear and he lightly bit her earlobe. His ring finger and middle finger slowly dipped into the fabric of her panties as his warm breath bathed her ear. Sarada. He nipped at her ear again. His pinky and index finger joined his other two fingers. Remember, he found the warmth between her legs, and his middle finger had no trouble instantly brushing her sweet spot. Sarada's panties already soaked in her body's excitement. Call me Naruto. He growled lustfully into her ear. His experienced fingers quickly pleasing her body. Sarada moaned uncontrollably at the touch of his fingers, his lustful voice, and his instruction. She moved her hips to match his fingers' movements. She had never been touched like this before, and never did she ever think it would be Naruto Uzumaki that would be doing it. She brought a hand to her face and pushed her glasses off her face. She let them fall to the carpet floor. Her hands grabbing at the blankets as the pleasure overwhelmed her. Naruto lifted his head so he could look down on her face. He watched her bite down on her lip, and her eyes closed tightly. He felt her hips pushing against his every touch, which encouraged him to move his fingers quicker and more forcefully. He could feel her body already wanting to tense, and he knew she was already close. He wondered if she knew that. He continued to watch her as he brought her closer and closer to orgasm. Sarada's stomach was tensing up, and within herself she could feel her body was so close to going over the edge. She released her lip from her teeth that had clamped down so hard on it. She tried to catch her breath. her hands still grasping at the blanket. Her hips still encouraging Naruto to keep pleasing her. Sarada opened her eyes to find that Naruto had been watching her. They made eye contact, and right at that very moment she couldn't keep herself from letting go anymore. Naruto, she moaned loudly, and her body jerked against his touch, and he knew, he let her enjoy the complete ecstasy. His fingers continued as she rode out the orgasm. Hearing his name come from her lips in that way was so arousing. He could not wait to hear it again. Finally a mission for Sarada. Days had passed since Naruto and Sarada shared the afternoon together. Sarada looked in the mirror and smiled at herself. She was not the kind of girl to give in to her own looks, or be vain about her appearance at all. In fact, she never really thought she was any prettier than the young ladies around her. Yet here she was looking at herself in the mirror and smiling. Whenever she found herself alone she couldn't help but think about Naruto's fit body so close to hers, her hands touching his body, and the exhilaration and pleasure he showed her that one afternoon. Naruto knew exactly what her body wanted. She could not help but think that of all the other people on the village, Naruto seemed drawn to her. She was not anything special, or so she thought. Sarada, you ready? Sakura called from their living room area. Let's go already. Sarada groaned as her thoughts rudely interrupted. She promised her mom she would spend the morning with her. It felt like a chore to be around her mom, even after growing up. Sarada, already irritated with her mom, left her room and met up with her mom. Right. Let's go. Sarada walked out with her mom and they set off on a morning that seemed to drag on and on. First Sakura stopped at Ino's shop to replace the flowers they had at home in their dining area. Then, off to a little market shop to find a new pair of earrings. Sarada walked aimlessly at her mom's heel and engaged minimally in her mom's small talk. Most of her small talk was boring anyway. Sarada never really seemed to get that mom and daughter connection, but Sakura sure did try. Would you like to stop and eat? Sakura pointed at Ichiraku ramen. I guess so, Sarada nodded. She was starting to feel hungry. They both entered the ramen house, which had expanded into a bigger building since the time Sakura was a kid. Sarada remembered hearing stories about all the destruction the village had been through as her mom grew up. Sarada and her mom both ordered the same ramen bowl, and took their time eating. Did you always believe in Nara the Hokage? Sarada asked her mom. She never really heard about how everyone felt about Naruto when he was younger. She just heard all great things he did for the village. Naruto. She blushed. No one took him seriously, Sarada. Well, how come? Sarada looked down at her ramen broth, and swirled her chopsticks in the liquid. He was uncool, and annoying. Sakura looked out the window, smiled at the sunlight on her face. But he sure turned out to be one we all relied on and depended on a lot. Sarada looked up at her mom. She could tell in the tone of her mom's voice that her mom really had grown fond of the Hokage. Annoying like Boruto. That's what you used to say, Boruto's just like his dad. Sarada made a face of misbelief. Sakura laughed and nodded as she turned her eyes back to Sarada. Just like that, but louder. The two of them finished eating, and left waving to the owner and thanking him for yet another delicious meal. As they left they continued their conversation with Sarada complaining endlessly about Boruto and telling her mom that there is no way the Hokage could be anything like Boruto. Sakura told her that if she didn't believe her she should ask others in the village. They both stopped by the park area and looked up at the Hokage's faces carved in the cliff side. But, a lot has changed. Sakura sounded like she was lost in thought. Admiring the view, a cheerful voice met Sarada's ears, and an arm rested over her shoulders, and Sarada looked over to see Naruto with both arms embracing Sarada and Sakura's shoulders. He had a very happy-go-lucky look on his face. Sakura glared at him. Sarada's heartbeat quickened realizing she was so close to him again, but this time in public, and in front of her mom. Sarada gulped down her nerves and nodded looking back at the Hokage's faces. Sakura elbowed Naruto in the ribs, and pulled herself out of Naruto's embrace. Naruto grabbed his ribs with his hand and let out a pain-filled, HMMMPH, Sarada blushed so hard as she looked at the Hokage in pain, but she didn't move. Oh Sakura. Naruto laughed. He and Sarada looked each other in the eye and Naruto winked at Sarada. Sarada didn't think she could blush any more than she already was. Sakura crossed her arms and made an irritated facial expression. Naruto lifted his arm from Sarada's shoulder. Sarada turned her back to her mom and continued to look in the Hokage's eye. She lightly bit her lip and let her teeth graze over her lip, and made a smirk in his direction. Sakura. Shikamaru was standing off to the side trying not to get mixed in with the nonsense Naruto made for himself. Shikamaru. She smiled at him. Well, we were just getting some fresh air, but we did intend on calling on Sarada today. Good thing we found you guys here. It is such a drag having to go looking. Shikamaru stood in his usual lazy fashion, hands in his pockets. Yep. We need a Team 7 member to go on a mission. Naruto couldn't help but stare at Sarada, but he knew he had to be careful how he looked, because while Sarada's back was to her mom's, Naruto's was not. Sakura could see his every expression. He stood up respectively. It has been a while for her, hasn't it? Sakura smiled at Shikamaru. Let me know if there is anything I can do to help. Sakura looked at Naruto now. Sarada turned her head to her mom and Shikamaru. Shikamaru sighed in a lazy sort of way. It isn't anything crazy. Naruto waved a hand at Sakura in a way that said don't overreact. Well then, Sakura waved to Sarada. I will see you later and you can tell me all about this mission. Sakura waved to the two men. Sarada waved bye to her mom, and then watched as her mom walked away. Moms. Shikamaru walked up beside Sarada and sighed again. This time his sigh was that of annoyance. Sarada nodded at Shikamaru's understanding of the annoyances of mothers. Naruto didn't say anything. Sarada realized of course he never had his parents. She felt her heart slightly sink into her stomach. Naruto made a somewhat forced smile. We got a special request from a couple Team 7 helped a while ago. They both seemed rather fond of you guys, but especially you, Sarada. Naruto explained. Yeah, it was the couple that needed to send a message to their son who was out on some spiritual ritual, something, soul searching, Shikamaru added. Oh, yeah, the man was really a thief and Konohamaru didn't have the heart to tell the parents at first, but I insisted we reunite them. Sarada nodded fondly of that mission. I remember. Yes. Shikamaru looked at Naruto. Well, shall we take this back to the office? Oh, yeah. Naruto nodded. The three of them walked back to the office to discuss details and exchange intel. Sarada walked some steps behind Shikamaru and Naruto. She found herself back in the haze of Naruto's presence. She loved those whiskers on his cheeks, his blonde hair, the playful smiles he got when he was carefree. ... You won't be going alone. I have found someone to keep you company. Thankfully also this should only take a day since they are in a neighboring village. They simply need you to be a witness at their son's wedding. Naruto handed Sarada the scroll that contained the invite. Wedding. Sarada was really caught off guard. A drag, we know. Shikamaru chimed in. But they are appreciative of you, and insist that you are the reason their son changed his ways. Don't tell me I will be stuck with someone lame for this mission. Naruto cleared his throat and raised an eyebrow. Number 1 lame in all of the Hidden Leaf. Shikamaru let a smile creep across his face. You. Sarada almost fainted imagining herself at a wedding with Naruto. Alone with him, on a mission, at a wedding, Sarada could feel her cheeks starting to get warm thinking about alone time with Naruto. Special invite. Naruto held up another scroll. Sarada felt nervous, but hid it well. She looked at Shikamaru. And are you also going? Our Hokage, silly as he is, can take care of himself and anyone in this village if it came down to it. I will just stay behind for this one. So Sarada, 2 days from now we will meet right outside the leaf. Naruto smiled. Troublesome, these kinds of gatherings. I am happy to not go. Shikamaru said in a tone that, for Shikamaru, could pass as thankful. Sarada nodded, and took her scroll from Naruto. All three of them said goodbye, and Sarada headed out of the office. Her mind was swimming with ideas of Naruto and her standing beside each other watching strangers saying, "I do," and people all dressed up. Sarada groaned thinking about what she would wear. She could not think of anything she owned that could pass as wedding kind of clothes. Sarada found herself thinking of Ino's shop, and that little orange flower she had seen. She got home and briefly explained the mission to her mom. The art of the shadow clone. Finding this whole mission to be unbelievable. Sarada walked toward the entrance to the hidden leaf. She was supposed to meet the Hokage in a matter of minutes. She had meant to get there earlier, but she burned her breakfast, and started over. By the time she realized what time it was, she had ended up eating and walking. Sarada looked around to see if the Hokage had made it over or not. A small smile crossed her face as she remembered that he was always late. She sighed and stepped just outside the village. She could not even imagine what to expect on this mission. It was considered a mission, and therefore Sarada knew she was representing the leaf. She tucked her hands in her pockets and kicked a rock on the ground. She thought about the idea of a wedding, and what it would feel like to be a bride. Sarada never gave it much thought about weddings. She might have thought about boys and dating, but marrying them. The thought seemed scary to her. Oh, phew. Naruto appeared looking and sounding relieved. Hokage. She smiled at him and their eyes met. She felt her heart beating in her ears. Come here. Naruto looked over his shoulder to make sure there wasn't unwanted attention. He started walking toward the trees off the road. Sarada pulled her hands from her pockets and followed him. He was wearing his Hokage cloak, and he didn't want people noticing. She thought to herself. They walked past a couple trees, and Naruto turned to her with a smile. Sarada stopped just feet from him and waited for him to speak. I hate doing this to you. Naruto brought his fingers up to his chest and started to form a jutsu. Sarada watched his fingers and knew right away that it was the famous shadow clone jutsu. She watched as he spoke the words, and an exact copy of him appeared right beside him. It smiled automatically. A clone. Sarada wasn't sure about what was going on. Yes. He will accompany you throughout the mission. I am Hokage, you know. He winked. But, Sarada looked at the clone, and then at the Hokage. She didn't want to question him, but she was not sure what the point was. Why? Sarada? Naruto let out a chuckle. He filled in the couple feet between them and looked into her eyes. Sarada felt her body fighting to stay still. Her body wanted to be closer to him, touching him. I can't leave a clone here. Shikamaru would kill me. You never said anything about a clone when we discussed the mission. Sarada just stared at him. She put her hands in her pockets and wrinkled her brow at him. The clone watched and waited. I promise next time we can find time alone it won't be a clone. He felt discouraged by the look on her face. He felt as though there was a mistrust in her eyes. He had tried so hard to be there for her in understanding her father. He had wanted her trust this whole time, and they developed something they could only share through trust. Sarada looked past the Hokage at the clone, and then back at the Hokage. Naruto lifted his hand behind his head and scratched nervously. Sarada took her hands from her pocket and walked to the clone. Well, let's go. She kept her back to the Hokage and waited on the clone. You got it. The clone smiled pleased that Sarada walked over to him. Hey, Sarada. Naruto felt a twinge of hurt in his heart at her walking past him with no words to say to him. Sarada turned to him. She tried her very best to look serious. Naruto wanted to tell her sorry or at least try to further explain, but looking at her serious face gave him a chill in his spine. He could see the Sakura in her now, the Sakura that would get so angry and annoyed with Naruto. He shook his head and waved. There I go screwing up again. Naruto couldn't even force a smile. His clone walked on, and Sarada quickly followed. As she walked she wiped her eyes. Did I really just hurt the Hokage's feelings? An hour into the mission and Sarada wasn't even sure what to say or do around this clone of the Hokage. She understood the purpose of shadow clones, and never had issues being around them. Sarada just didn't think she would be alone with a Hokage clone for this mission. She expected the real Hokage. Of course, it would be like Shikamaru to insist that the real Naruto stay in the village. She caught the clone's eyes and made herself smiled. Clone or not, he still represented Naruto Uzumaki. Should we take a break? The clone offered, turning to a small boulder that seemed okay to sit on. He, of course, had the chakra of Naruto, so he was far from being tired. A water break, Sarada said as she tossed her backpack on the boulder, but she overshot the toss and it slipped right off behind the boulder. The clone of the Hokage hopped right over and quickly picked it up and placed it on the boulder. He grabbed the water container from the side pocket and walked it to Sarada. Thank you. She took the water from his hands and the clone nudged his fingers forward just enough that her fingers touched his. She felt her cheeks get warm. The clone smiled widely at her as her cheeks grew pink. Warming up to me, finally. He slid his fingers from hers. I don't know what you mean. Sarada lifted the water to her lips. She sensed the mischievous undertone in his comment. Hey, I suppose it would be weird to be around a clone. The Hokage's clone nervously scratched the back of his neck. But I am still Naruto. Sarada found his nervousness cute. His whiskers seemed to adopt the same pinkish color that he would get if he was embarrassed. Sarada smiled. She wished it was the real Naruto here with her though. She remembered the look on his face before she left. Sarada meant to be rude, but not in a way that would hurt him. She just wanted to get the point across that she didn't like this plan at all. Ready to move on, the clone lowered his hand from his neck. He watched her in thought for a moment. We only have a couple hours if we are to arrive on time, you know. Of course. Sarada geared up and they started walking again. I know a shortcut. The clone pointed through a bunch of trees and foliage that was off the path. Team 7 shortcut. The clone sounded nostalgic. Sarada smiled hearing that. Sarada, the clone looked over at the young woman. Sarada looked up at him and she saw a spark in his blue eyes, life. She bit her lip. Chakra flows through him, Naruto's chakra, clone or not, I see that same spark in his eyes. Yes, Hokage. Sarada addressed him respectfully. You know the Hokage should stay in the village, right? The clone spoke as though he wasn't talking about Naruto at all. But he doesn't always, does he? Her tone pouty, but rude at the same time. You are right, but Shikamaru's job is to help advise and encourage the Hokage in the decision-making process. The clone stopped walking when he got to a tree that was surrounded by thick branches and plants. Okay. Sarada shrugged at his explanation. She looked up at the tree and then around her at all the plants. The clone grabbed Sarada's hand and pulled her body close to his. He looked down into her eyes. The clone placed his hands on her shoulders and he licked his bottom lip, begging for a kiss. Sarada recalled standing in the Uzumaki home and seeing Naruto do that. She breathed in deeply and gulped down her uncertainty. She put her hands on his chest. The intention was not to hurt your feelings, Sarada, the clone whispered as he leaned in to kiss her lips. Sarada couldn't stop herself from giving in to the moment. She kissed him back and both parted their lips. The moments passed as they held on each other and kissed. Sarada's hands moved down his torso, and she tucked her index and middle fingers into the clone's front pockets. She pulled his hips to hers. The clone let out a pleasurable grunt at their hips touching. Hokage. Sarada pulled out of the kiss. Naruto. He corrected her with a wink and foxy smirk. Sarada instantly blushed. Call me Naruto, Sarada. Hey. Sarada lost her thought for a moment as she got lost in the ecstasy of saying his name in the way she had that afternoon a week ago. We better get going, Sarada said, biting her lip. She hated having to let go of this moment, but a mission is a mission and it needed to be completed. Oh, yeah, the clone chuckled. Right. He cleared his throat and they both stepped back from each other. The wedding. Once the two of them entered the village, they were greeted by the parents of the soon-to-be groom. Sarada left the majority of talking to the clone of the Hokage. She spoke up here and there, and of course thanked them for the invitation to the wedding. The parents took them into their home and let them use their home to clean themselves up and prepare for the wedding that was in fact going to be starting soon. Sarada found that she was ready first, and in a small way it did not surprise her. She somehow had a feeling that even the real Hokage would have taken forever too. Sarada wandered out to the front yard of the home. She looked up at the sky and watched the clouds slowly moving. She gazed into the blue sky and found after a moment or two her thoughts had shifted from the blue sky to the handsome blue eyes of the Hokage. Sarada bit her lip thinking about him. She wondered what the Hokage was doing right now. She wondered if he might be regretting his decision to do what Shikamaru advised him to do. Advised? Really though. Naruto is a Hokage, not Shikamaru. The Hokage can go over some advice. Sarada started to feel annoyed and irritable again. Sarada kicked a rock at her feet, and watched it roll across the grass, and waited to see where it landed. Her eyes found themselves fixed on a small patch of orange flower petals. She remembered those very flowers being the same as the ones she saw in Ino's flower shop. Sarada walked to the flowers and knelt down. She looked over all the flowers to find the brightest, most vibrant orange petals that stood out in her Uchiha eyes. She reached for one and pulled it from the rest. She stood up admiring the orange color and petal design. She smiled at the way she found herself lost in such a silly colored flower. She smirked. Orange flowers do seem to be unusual, she thought, trying to recall the last time she had ever seen orange flowers out in the wild, while on missions. She twisted the stem slowly between her fingers, to see the petals swirl and twirl in her hand. Oh, Sarada, there you are. The voice of the Hokage broke her from her thoughts. She turned on her heel to see a very handsome clone of the Hokage standing at the porch step. She gulped down the dryness in her throat and tried not to make her thought of him looking handsome to be obvious. She didn't know how it was possible, but even black pants and a long-sleeved black shirt looked fine on the Hokage. She wondered for a moment why he would choose to wear all black to a wedding, but then she noticed he had over his shoulder his Hokage cloak. So, he wasn't entirely in all black. She smiled at him, and he smiled back at her. Yeah, I needed some fresh air. She shrugged. We have been in fresh air all day, Sarada. The clone chuckled. He stepped toward her and glanced down at the flower in her hand. I guess that is true. She looked down at the flower, and then looked up at the clone. Their eyes met, and Sarada felt the warmth in her cheeks. The clone took a couple more steps until they were within touching distance. He leaned his face to her ear. You look beautiful, you know. He whispered in her ear. Sarada let out a small uncontrollable whimper of approval for his compliment. The clone of the Hokage smirked at her reaction. He lightly brushed his lips swiftly across her ear and let his warm breath linger on her earlobe. He pulled away from her. He continued to smirk. Sarada looked into his eyes and found herself intoxicated with the presence of the Hokage and lost in the moment. The clone winked at her and grazed his teeth over his bottom lip. Sarada tried her very best to hold back the noise in her throat. They both looked deeply into each other's eyes. Both of them forgetting they were standing in an open area, where anyone could happen to see. The space between their bodies seemed like miles. Sarada wanted to feel his hands on her body again. There was a bark from a dog down the street, and the clone's concentration on Sarada shifted. He looked past her to see that there were people approaching, on their way to the wedding. Sarada realized this too, as she looked over her shoulder. She turned back to the Hokage's clone and made a small shy smile. Well, the clone cleared his throat. The wedding. Sarada's smile grew wider. Yes. The clone grinned, and tucked his free hand into his pocket, and the other hand continued to hang his Hokage cloak over his shoulder. Sarada looked down at the flower in her fingers, and then at the Hokage's face. She lifted the flower up and walked to the Hokage. She tucked the flower stem into the pocket of his shirt, and she took a step back and grinned. She could not imagine the Hokage without Orange. The wedding started shortly after the two of them found their seats. Sarada would glance up at the clone every once in a while, and both of them would exchange a look of discomfort. Sarada could only imagine what was on the clone's mind. She would find herself staring down at her lap, staring at her fingernails, examining them, as she thought about weddings, love, relationships, and her feelings for a man like Naruto. She got lost thinking about how he looked without a shirt, the smell of his skin, hearing his voice instructing her to call him Naruto, she started blushing and her hands covered her face as she felt the warmth in her cheeks. By the time the wedding ended, Sarada had managed to regain her complexion on her cheeks, and her thoughts cleared from the fantasy playing out in her mind. We can only stay for another hour, okay? The clone glanced to the window and Sarada looked over too. The sun was going to start setting soon. Sarada was okay with staying another hour only. She was eager to return to the hidden leaf. But didn't the groom and bride want us to be at the reception? Sarada asked. We just won't stay long. The clone smiled at Sarada. Sarada smiled back at him. The clone's smile turned into a quick fox-like smirk. Sarada turned her head slowly to hide her blushing cheeks again. She wondered if the clone had noticed her during the wedding. By the time Sarada and the clone of the Hokage heading back to Konoha, the sun was stretching its last bit of light across the sky. Sarada guessed that there would be at least an hour and a half left of light. She and the clone talked about what time they thought they would make it back to the hidden leaf, and they both concluded that it might be past 8 p.m. Knowing me, the clone spoke of his real self offhandedly. I will probably be awake in the office or at home. The clone put his hand to his stomach and shrugged. Or, Ichiraku's ramen, of course. Sarada smiled. Sarada's steps were in the same pace as the clone's. They were walking on a road now, and home seemed close now. The sun's light faded quickly. Sarada looked at the clone as they walked and thought about earlier in the day. She had forgotten he was even a clone for a couple moments on this mission. She glanced over his body as they walked. The Hokage's eyes shifted to hers. They both smirked at each other. You know how a shadow clone jutsu works? The clone asked as he turned his eyes back to the path in front of them. Yay. Sarada turned her eyes to the path again too. She wondered why he asked. When I release the shadow clone jutsu, well, I being the me that is real, Yano, the clone laughed at himself. Everything from today will become a part of the real me. The clone glanced down at the space between their bodies as they walked. Sarada's thought drifted away from her for a moment as she thought back on the morning. She would have to look the Hokage in his eye knowing that he is going to know every detail of this mission, and still report to him. She was going to have to look into his bright blue eyes after giving him the look she did in the morning. Hey, yeah, I know. Sarada tried to sound confident, but her voice betrayed her, as it came off uneasy and timid. Sarada. The clone reached out to her and grabbed her hand. Sarada looked down at their hands. She brought her eyes up to his, and the clone smirked at her. Sarada stared into the clone's eyes waiting on his words. I just want you to know that every moment we've touched or caught each other's eye. Or stole a moment to be alone, the clone shrugged. I am going to know about it. Duh. She tried to imagine being alone in the Hokage's office as the Hokage released the jutsu and was brought up to speed on the day's happenings. She remembered the thoughts that raced through her mind during the wedding. Sarada looked down at their hands and shook her head slightly. The clone released her hand and felt the distance between them return. He started walking again. Sarada looked up seeing the clone continue to walk. She took a deep breath and started walking after him. She realized that once again she came off rudely. She just walked with the clone without saying a word. Almost home. I am sure the jutsu will be released soon. The clone's tone was serious. Sarada didn't say anything but continued to walk. They came to the main entrance, and the clone stopped by the tree where he first appeared. He smiled at Sarada. The very last sliver of sunlight made an orange beam of light around Sarada. Sarada glanced toward the village, and then looked at the clone of the Hokage. Thank you for going with me. Sarada said with a small smile. Sarada, you know already that I would have come myself in person. The clone sounded sincere. I know. Shikamaru told you not to, I get it already. Sarada waved a hand at the topic coming up again. Sarada, the clone interrupted. On your way to me, don't get lost. The clone looked at the main entrance. You seem unsure of yourself today. The clone turned to walk away. I am not, Hokage, Sarada said, reaching out to grab the Hokage's hand. As soon as her fingers brushed his skin, the clone disappeared. She got startled by his disappearance. Sarada groaned in irritation at her situation. Don't get lost, she groaned again, thinking about that statement. She turned to the village and went on walking. The sun was gone now, and she knew she needed to report to the Hokage, but she was unsure of where he could be. Sarada walked to Ichiraku's first, thinking that might be exactly where he was. She left Ichiraku's with no luck of seeing the Hokage. She walked to the Hokage's office and knocked on the door. She waited patiently for a reply. Come in. The Hokage's voice echoed from inside the room. Sarada half hoped he wasn't there because she wasn't sure what to expect his reaction to be. Sarada turned the door knob and pushed the door open slowly. When she was in the room, the Hokage motioned for her to close the door. Sarada obeyed his hand gesture. Sarada saw Shikamaru leaned against the wall on the opposite side of the room, with his back turned. He appeared to be looking out the window at the village. The Hokage watched Sarada come in. Sarada felt her nervousness take over. She balled her fingers up into a fist, and she tried to keep cool. Hokage, she started. Sarada, maybe you need to get some rest, you can report back in the morning. The Hokage suggested with a concerned tone. But, Sarada started. The Hokage held up a hand. Better than reporting to me here, Sarada. I will go to you. Go home and get rest. Sarada looked over at Shikamaru, who had turned to the Hokage with a look of confusion on his face. But, Sarada tried again to speak. Lord Seventh, I don't think that would be necessary for you to go to her home tomorrow. This was a simple mission. There were no complications. Shikamaru cut Sarada off this time. Sarada rolled her eyes at Shikamaru's words. He was the whole reason Sarada was mad at the Hokage. Naruto turned his head to Shikamaru. When the clone jutsu was released, there was nothing I needed to mention for a mission report, you were right. However, I will be meeting Sakura in the morning for breakfast to discuss important medic corps schedule changes, and I did not see reason to make Sarada come all the way over here if I would be at her home in the morning. Naruto glanced over at Sarada and for a second, she could have sworn she saw him wink. Sarada shifted on her feet. She looked at Shikamaru, still looking for his response. All Shikamaru did was nod his head thoughtfully and mumble something but could not make out the words. Come now, Shadow Ninja. The Hokage grinned. Don't disrespect me in front of Sarada. Sarada raised an eyebrow in amusement seeing Shikamaru being corrected by the Hokage in front of her. Shikamaru shook his head and walked to the door of the office and opened it. Right. Let's all go home for the evening. The Hokage stood up and put on his cloak. Sarada watched him for a moment and turned to the door. She looked Shikamaru in the eyes and then walked through the doorway without a word. As she walked down the hall and outside, she could hear their voices behind her, and the sound of their swift feet. She listened, trying to make out the words. She could tell both of them were in disagreement. She could not make out much, but she did hear Uchiha, Sasuke, and Shadow Clone. Sarada continued walking and their voices and footsteps faded. Sarada managed to get up to her room without much push from her mom. She was glad that her mom was not in one of her moods to know every little detail, because that was the last thing Sarada wanted to do. Sarada got into some clean clothes and crawled in her bed. She pulled the blanket to her chest and turned over on her side. She stared out the window at the night sky. She started thinking about the clone of the Hokage, and his last words to her. Sarada's body was more tired than she must have realized, because she had stayed in bed much later than she wanted to. She squinted at the sunlight pooling into her room from the window. Sarada sat up and stretched. She climbed out of bed and gathered up her clothes. She went to the bathroom down the hall and proceeded to bathe and get dressed for the day. After she was dressed, she stood in front of the mirror in the restroom and combed out her hair. She took a deep breath and let out a sigh. She was debating in her mind what in all of Konoha the Hokage was going to say about the mission. Sarada put away her brush and left the restroom. She started to walk to the kitchen to get something to eat. As she walked to the kitchen, she heard her mom at the front door. Sarada poked her head in the living room and saw the Hokage with his back turned to her, looking at a picture of old Team 7 on the wall. Sarada's eyes widened, and she looked toward the front door to see who her mom was talking to. She bit her lip and turned her head and disappeared into the kitchen. She felt her heart beating quickly, and her cheeks already getting warm. Okay, well, I guess I don't have a choice. Thank you. Tell them I will be there shortly. Sakura closed the door and walked into the living space. Naruto. Sakura smiled as she saw him looking at the old Team 7 picture. Sarada's ears perked hearing the Hokage being called by name. Don't worry, Sakura. Naruto turned to his old teammate and smiled. Sakura felt for a moment like she was looking at the goofy little kid Naruto. I can go check on Sarada. I don't know why she isn't awake yet. Don't bother her. Naruto raised a hand. She is probably tired. I can come by after you are done at work. Naruto smirked. Are you sure? Sakura smiled at him. Anything for Team 7. Naruto smiled and pointed to the picture of the much younger Sakura. Sarada bit her lip and walked into the living room from the kitchen and stood by her mom. She glanced at her mom, and then at Naruto. She tried to calm her heart down. The Hokage standing in her living room was not how she expected this day to start. Sakura made a face at Sarada. How long have you been in there? I just came in, Sarada said defensively. Oh. Sakura looked over at Naruto. She can report now before I go. Sakura. They need you at the Med Corp. You should go. Sarada and I will just make a quick report and then she can go about her day. Naruto turned around to admire his younger smile and let the two talk amongst themselves. Sarada, there was somewhat of an emergency that I need to tend to. Please be polite and tell the Hokage everything he needs to know. I will let you know how long I will be gone, as soon as I know. Sakura smiled at her daughter and reached out to pat her arm. Sarada tried her best to control her body and not blush. She nodded at her mom's words and smiled back at her mom. Naruto, we can finish our talk later, and thank you again for making time for this. Sakura looked over at Naruto. Got to keep this village healthy and safe. Naruto grinned like a little kid and gave Sakura a thumb up. Of course. Sakura waved to the two and turned to leave her home. Sarada turned to the Hokage and he was already smirking at her. She took a deep breath and walked toward the living room and bit the inside of her lip. She had too many thoughts running through her mind. Why is he smirking like that? Why isn't he annoyed at me? What could he possibly want to talk to me about right now? Why do we need a mission report when the clone obviously was a perfect record of the mission? Why does the Hokage look so damn hot? Does he even realize how attractive he is? I could look into his blue eyes all day. I missed him, the smell of his body, the touch of his hands on me, seeing his eyes filled with lust, the way he reminded her to call him Naruto. Sarada's blushing was accompanied by her body feeling slightly weakened from her thoughts alone. Her heart was bursting from nervousness as well. You do know that we don't really have to make a report, right? Naruto's smirk seemed to get more mischievous with the playful tone in his voice. I figured. Sarada looked into his eyes. I can tell you are too distracted anyway. He reached his hands out and grabbed Sarada's hands. He pulled her towards himself. Sarada's body did not fight him. Sarada looked up at Naruto. Naruto stepped back until the back of his legs were against the couch. He pulled her body close. Naruto let go of her hands, and he placed his own hands on her hips. He looked into her eyes with a small smile. Naruto, Sarada spoke quietly. You aren't mad at me. Are you sure you understand how clones work? Naruto sat down on the couch. His hands stayed on her hips. As he sat, he playfully pulled her body closer to the couch till Sarada's feet were standing in between his. Everything that happened yesterday between you and I was resolved between you and my clone, which really ends up being me in the end. Sarada looked down as her body was forced to move forward. She bit her lip, noticing just how close the two of them really are to each other. She looked up his body till her eyes met his. Naruto let go of her hips and leaned back on the couch and smirked. His body language trying to lead Sarada off the subject of talking. But, Sarada, Naruto sat up enough that his hands could reach her hips again. He pulled her body into his lap. both of them looking into each other's eyes. Naruto placed one hand on the small of her back and the other hand moved up her side. Both of them found themselves lost in the moment. Naruto pressed the small of her back to encourage her to lean over his torso a little. His hand at her side was now at her neck, and he caressed her neck with his thumb. Sarada leaned it, pressing her hips against his. Her hands moved up his torso. He lowered his head to his cheek and kissed his cheek. "There you go," Naruto whispered as he turned his face to kiss her on the cheek as well. Sarada turned her face so their lips brushed. Naruto kissed her lips and almost instantly dived into the kiss by parting his lips and deepening the kiss. Sarada's fingers curled, grabbing the fabric of his shirt. Naruto lightly pressed his hips up against hers, at the same time pressing the small of her back. Sarada moaned against their kissing as she felt her body grow excited and could tell that Naruto's was too getting into the moment. Naruto pulled out of the kiss to look into Sarada's eyes. He smirked as he moved his hips against her body again. Sarada let out a breath as she could feel just how much Naruto was enjoying this moment. "What if my mom comes home soon?" Sarada felt so stupid saying something like that in a moment like this, but Sarada could not even begin to imagine what that would be like. How horrifying it would be to have her mom walk in and see them like this. "Don't worry." Naruto moved his hands to her thighs and ran his hands over the form of her legs. "I got an idea." Naruto moved his hands under her legs and he sat up. Sarada naturally moved her hands to his shoulders, unsure of what he was going to do, or if she would fall over. "What?" Sarada looked into his eyes. Naruto winked. "Your room." Naruto stood up, one of his hands under her backside and the other over her lower back. Sarada looked at him wide-eyed and shook her head. Naruto smirked and nodded. He started to walk up the stairs to her room and Sarada found herself wrapping her arms around his neck and legs around his waist. She closed her eyes and grinned. This whole morning seemed so strange, and being carried up her own stairs by the Hokage who she had been making out with, Sarada blushed. As they entered the room, Sarada looked quickly at the floor of the room to make sure she had at least picked up a little bit. She was happy to see nothing embarrassing laying around. Naruto kicked the door closed as gently as he could, and quickly freed one of his hands to click the door locked. Sarada's heart raced thinking about Naruto being in her room. She lowered her face to his neck and took in the scent of his skin and clothes. She felt overwhelmed with the moment. Naruto walked to the bed and sat himself down. As he sat, Sarada released her arms from holding him so tightly. The thought of him being strong enough to carry her made him seem even more attractive. Naruto smiled up at her. Sarada's hands found his shoulders, and she was just a little bit taller than him in this position. She was able to look straight into his eyes, and smile. "Take off your glasses," Naruto spoke in a lower tone. Sarada lifted her hands to her face. As she did, Naruto's hands moved up her torso, beneath the fabric of her top. Sarada slowly took off her glasses and laid them down at her side. He tugged her top fabric up off her torso. Sarada tried not to blush or get self-conscious. Naruto made short work of getting her bra off too. He laid back on the bed, pulling her down with him. He kissed her lips and they got lost in touching each other's bodies and removing each other's clothes. Several minutes had passed, and they found themselves pressing their hips against each other in the heat of the moment. Naruto's torso fully exposed, and Sarada was trailing kisses down his collarbone. He let out a groan into the silence of the room. He placed a hand behind her neck to encourage her that he liked what she was doing. "Feels so good," he breathed in a raspy voice. His hands finding the waistline of her shorts. He started to unbutton and slowly tugging them off her hips. Sarada slowly lowered her kisses to Naruto's chest, and scooted her body down off his lap. She stood between his legs but was still bathing his bare torso in kisses and lightly licking the sensitive skin. She could not believe she was doing this, or that whatever she was doing was actually pleasing Naruto. Naruto's hands fell to the bed and just Sarada had this moment. He closed his eyes and groaned again as he felt Sarada's upper body rub against his groin as she kissed his skin. Sarada's hands started tugging her shorts off her hips. She wriggled out of her bottoms. She lifted her head, smiling up at Naruto. blanket. She moved her hands to his pants and started to undo his pants. Naruto watched her. For a girl who was inexperienced in this sort of thing, she was doing a good job pleasing him. He grabbed the blanket at the foot of the bed and brought it close to his body. Close your eyes. Sarada blushed. Naruto slowly sat up, handing her the blanket. He closed his eyes and smirked. He found her shyness cute. Sarada climbed on the bed and covered her body with the blanket. Naruto waited for a moment before opening his eyes, and he turned his head to her. He stood up and grinned at her as he removed all his clothes. Naruto got under the blankets, positioning himself over her body. Sarada. Naruto's lips brushed against her ear. Their bodies both on edge. They both knew what was about to happen, and it made every sense heighten as the moments passed. Sarada was biting her lip, feeling every bit nervous. Her heart was pounding. Her hands on Naruto's biceps. Naruto, Sarada whispered, sounding nervous. Tell me if you want to stop, okay? Naruto lifted his head to look into her eyes. Sarada stared into his lust-filled eyes. Sarada nodded and parted her lips as her felt Naruto's fingers moving to her inner thigh. He slowly eased his fingers inside her body. He looked down at her body as he prepared her body. Sarada lifted her chin, letting out a groan of pleasure. Naruto used his other hand to caress her soft skin along her ribs. He lowered his forehead to rest against her body as he pleased her body. Touching her, smelling her, feeling her, and hearing her groan was arousing him even more. Naruto bit down on Sarada's shoulder to muffle the moan leaving his lips. Sarada took in a sharp breath at the pain of Naruto pushing himself in her body and the pain of Naruto's teeth on her shoulder. Naruto pulled out from her skin and lowered his forehead against her shoulder as he took in a breath. Ada. He exhaled, trying to be quiet. The discomfort and pain added an unusual sense of pleasure. Naruto slowly thrusted again. Sarada's fingers moved up his arms until Naruto's biceps were beneath her fingers. She held onto his arms. Her eyes slowly opened and she turned her cheek to the top of Naruto's head. She pushed her hips against his thrust. Both of them let out a pant at the feeling of their bodies working together. More. Sarada breathed against the Hokage's hair. Hearing Sarada say that made Naruto lift his head and looked into her eyes. Both of them looked into each other's eyes, drunk off their lust for one another. Naruto licked his bottom lip. Sarada took in a deep breath again. She knew that look meant he was feeling playful. Sarada moved one hand to his chest and trailed her fingers down to his hip. Naruto pressed his body into her again, and this time more forceful, less careful. Sarada bit her lip, holding back the words she knew wouldn't come out quietly. Naruto lowered his lips to hers. They both kissed lustfully. Sarada's hips worked in rhythm with his as they found pleasure taking over more and more with every movement. Their kissing intensified the movements of their body. Sarada's hands began roaming all over Naruto's body, her head lifted up off the pillow to try and deepen the kiss even more than it already was. Naruto moaned her name against their kissing. Sarada felt euphoric that the Hokage, Naruto Uzumaki, saying her name like that. She felt her stomach burning with lust for this older man. She was feeling less and less shy about this situation. She lowered her head slowly so that they were forced to pull out of the kissing. She stared up into his blue eyes as he opened his eyes. Naruto, Sarada moaned. Naruto smirked hearing his name. That is so hot, Sarada. Naruto's voice sounding than Sarada could have ever imagined it would. She bit her lip, trying to hide the smile that was creeping on her face. She could tell that Naruto could see the smile even in her effort to hide it. Both of them returned to kissing. Sarada's hands found the curve of Naruto's body and her hands pushed his hips down, encouraging him to be a little more forceful. She grazed her teeth against his bottom lip. Naruto gave in to her actions. ... Naruto lazily opened his eyes, feeling somewhat hazy. His hands were holding Sarada close to his. They both must have fallen asleep. He looked over her peaceful sleeping face. He closed his eyes again. He didn't know how long they both had fallen asleep for, and he didn't care. He caressed his nose and cheek against the top of her head and kissed her forehead. Sarada let out a relaxed sigh. Son of the Hokage. Sarada let out a sleepy sigh, opening her eyes and finding that she was alone in her room. A part of her was disappointed, and yet there was a smile on her face just knowing what had happened in this bed. She closed her eyes and turned her nose to snuggle her face into the pillow that now smelled like Naruto. She inhaled deeply, wanting that scent to stay with her. She hugged the blanket bundled up against her side. As she laid there for the moment, she thought about how Naruto managed to get out of the house, and if he managed to go unseen. She did not want to get out of the bed, but Sarada didn't even know if her mom was home yet. If her mom wasn't home yet, she would be home soon, and Sarada already was expecting her mom would ask rubbish questions about the mission, and Naruto being here in the home. Sarada groaned, not looking forward to that. Sitting up, Sarada realized she had carelessly taken her glasses off earlier and without paying attention to where she put them had misplaced them. She lifted the pillows and the blanket looking to see if they were still on the bed. She felt irritated with herself. She looked over the edge of the bed on the floor and didn't see them. She climbed out of the bed, gathering her clothes up in hopes that they would be unbroken and laying beneath her clothes. They were not there though. She put her clothes back on and was about to get on her knees and look under the bed, but an orange blur caught her attention on the nightstand. Sarada looked over the top of the nightstand, and there laying on the nightstand was her glasses with an orange flower. Sarada put her glasses on and took the flower into her hand. She smiled, staring at the bright orange petals. This was the same kind of flower she saw in Ino's flower shop, and the same kind of flower she found in the village on her mission. She looked out her window, feeling happiness fill her heart. She never felt such a connection to any other male in her life. She put the flower to her nose and breathed in the earthy scent as the petals brushed her lips and tickled her. She got lost in her thoughts, thinking about Naruto, and how sweet of a gesture that was for him to go out of his way to find this little flower just for her. She thought about what he must have done to find it. She got a silly scene in her head of 20 or 30 Naruto clones racing to find a flower. They tugged and pulled at roots until they found one. She giggled because in her thoughts they all started tackling the one that finally found it, arguing that they would get it to the Hokage before anyone else. She looked down at the flower and gathered her thoughts. She imagined that's exactly what happened. Heading down the stairs, Sarada prepared herself for just in case her mom was home and had her arsenal of motherly questions ready to aim at Sarada. Sarada tucked the flower behind her back. As she walked into the living room area, she found her mom was home, and she was poring over a medical ninja scroll. "Oh, you are home. I didn't hear you come in." Sarada smiled, trying to act as casual as possible. "Sarada." Sakura smiled, looking up at her daughter. "I didn't even know you were home either. I thought you might have left." "Nope. Was just in my room, boring." Sarada rolled her eyes. "Well, we didn't get to talk about your mission, so how did everything go?" "Mom, super simple. Nothing to go all crazy about." Sarada waved her free hand, gesturing that it wasn't worth her time. "You always say that." "Well," Sarada shrugged. "Boring missions that have nothing worth noting." Sarada tried to sell it this time, because it was a mission of the complete opposite, and yet she didn't want anyone thinking that. "And the meeting with the Hokage?" Sakura glanced at the childhood picture on the wall of Naruto, and the rest of Team 7. "It was fine." Sarada nodded and glanced over at the picture now too. "He didn't make a fool of himself, did he?" Sarada looked over at the couch where they had started making out. Sarada smiled. It was quite the opposite actually. She recalled his strength as he stood up from the couch and walked her up the stairs. Her smile widened. She still could not believe that all just happened. "Of course, he did." Sakura shook her head with a smirk. "Oh, Naruto will always be Naruto." Sarada wondered how in the world her mom grew up with that blonde little boy, and watched him grow into a teen, and then the man he is now, and not be attracted to him. She wondered for a moment what her dad had that Naruto didn't. What made her dad more special than Naruto? Her eyes lowered to the ground and she suddenly felt irritated thinking about her dad. She sighed. "Sarada. Sorry I was gone this morning." Sakura watched her daughter lower her head. "Work," Sarada said dully. "I get it." She turned and walked in the kitchen. She slid the orange flower in front of her. Sarada looked around for a snack. It was supposed to be my day off, Sakura said, trying to remind her daughter that she was planning to make time for Sarada. I get it, Mom. Things happen. Sarada looked around a little more. Now that her dad was on her mind, she felt irritated. She pushed aside some food packages, and lost interest in eating now. She returned to the living room and stared at her mom. I am going to go out. I guess you're busy anyways, Sarada sighed. Maybe we can meet somewhere for dinner. Sakura smiled, trying to make up for missing out on time with her daughter. Okay, Sarada shrugged. Meet at sunset at Ichiraku's. Sarada suggested. Ramen. Sakura laughed. Definitely have been spending a lot of time around the Hokage. Sarada lifted a hand to her face embarrassingly. I guess so. Well, don't be late. Sakura waved a hand at her mom. I will be there. Sarada turned quickly, realizing she was starting blush as she thought about spending time with the Hokage. Sarada did not even realize she said Ichiraku's until her mom said ramen. She shook her head walking down the street. The Hokage would have said ramen in a heartbreak without hesitation, and without thinking. Sarada held the orange flower in her finger, twirling the stem in her fingers. She had no idea where she was going or what exactly she wanted to do. She just knew she needed to get outside for a while before her mom pried more into the mission details. Oh, Sarada. Chocho waved from a distance. Sarada looked up to see Inojin, Shikadai and Chocho sitting on a small grassy patch just beyond the playground. Sarada forced a smile and waved back. She hoped the three of them were too busy to expect her to join them. By the looks of it though, she was about to beckon over. Sit with us. Come on. Chocho gestured for Sarada to join them. Sarada wanted to just run away, but she knew Chocho wouldn't let that happen. Sarada walked to them. She sat on the grass next to Chocho. Chocho was eating from a bag of chips and grinned widely at Sarada. Sarada forced a smile. Inojin was bent over a sketch journal that was open on the grass. Sarada couldn't make out what he was drawing. Sarada turned her head to Shikadai, who was staring at the playground. After a moment of silence, Shikadai looked at Sarada, who was staring at him. Your dad is so annoying, Sarada spoke bluntly. You're telling me, Shikadai sighed. Another week without a piece of technology. What the hell is a guy like me supposed to do? Shikadai leaned back in the grass, placing his hands behind his head. Shikadai watched the clouds move across the sky. Why don't you get missions and buy your own stuff? Sarada made a so what face at Shikadai's complaint. Advisor to the who? Shikadai lifted his head to look at Sarada. You didn't even try though, did you? Sarada rolled her eyes. Shikadai let his head fall back on his hands. He closed his eyes, ignoring Sarada. Who cares about Shikadai's dad? How was the wedding? Chocho smirked at Sarada. It was fine, but... Sarada made a confused face. How did you even know? Number 1 Big Mouth Ninja. Inojin finally spoke up. He didn't take his eyes off his work. Boruto. Sarada bent her knees and pulled her knees to her chest. She put the orange flower in her lap. She wrapped her arms around her legs. Boruto. That makes sense, she thought as she rested her head on her arms. So you got to go with one of the Hokage's clones. Chocho began to pry again. How was it? Probably so annoying, Shikadai said coolly. Dad says the Hokage and Boruto are the same. I thought you got along with Boruto. Inojin piped in. Well, it is like you said, number 1 Big Mouth Ninja. Shikadai lifted his head to look at Inojin. Inojin smirked, looking at Shikadai. He does have a big mouth. Inojin said in a matter-of-fact tone. Sarada sighed. Boruto was so annoying. How could anyone say that Boruto and Naruto are the same? They were not the same. Sarada spent more time fighting with Boruto than she actually did getting along with him some days. Sarada started thinking about how Boruto from time to time would complain about the Hokage. She hated that the most. Sarada felt the loneliness in her heart consume her. She buried her face in her arms as Inojin and Shikadai continued to jokingly mock, jokingly make fun of, and impersonate Boruto. Sarada's thoughts lingering on the absence of her own father. She could not understand how anyone that has both parents in their life would have the nerve to complain about their life being unfair. She just wanted to know her dad, she just wanted to see him finally. Oh hey, Sarada. There you are. Boruto's voice carried to her ears. Inojin and Shikadai got quiet. Sarada picked up her head, and there was Boruto running towards them. She rolled her eyes. Why does he always show up when I don't want him around? She thought irritably. Boruto crouched down beside her. What Boruto? She looked into his eyes. Sarada looked down at her arms. What do you mean, what Boruto? Boruto repeated her words in his best impression of her annoying voice. Konohamaru wants to meet with us. He told me to find you. This could be like the perfect time to get a good mission. Boruto grinned widely. Wait, Sarada, you never even told us about the mission. Chocho groaned in disappointment. Maybe she doesn't want to tell us. Inojin looked from Chocho to Sarada. Is that true, Sarada? Chocho gave Sarada a hurt facial expression. Sarada looked up at Chocho. Inojin was right, but Sarada knew better than to hurt Chocho's feelings. Chocho. Sarada groaned at the position Inojin had left her in. Sometimes Sarada wondered why she even bothered with being in the presence of all her friends. Come on. Boruto's voice filled with excitement. No. Boruto. I asked her a question. Chocho glared at Boruto. Boruto looked Chocho in the eye, but then looked to Sarada again. Sarada looked from Boruto to Chocho. Here we go. Shikadai sighed and laid back down in the grass. Inojin, you are that bored. Sarada tried to think quickly. She was not about to get stuck with Chocho mad. No one wants to be stuck with an upset or mad Chocho. She bit her lip and looked down in her lap, finding the flower there still. She took the flower in her fingers and got on her knees. Chocho, how could we even talk with these two dumbasses talking about the number one big mouth ninja? Sarada pointed to Shikadai and Inojin. Chocho tried to hold back a smirk, because the number one big mouth ninja was crouched right beside Sarada. Shikadai and Inojin looked at each other, then as they started laughing they looked at Boruto. Chocho's eyes widened seeing Boruto's confused expression and she tried to hold in the laughter trying to escape her throat. I owe you, okay. Sarada forced a smile. Okay. Chocho glanced at Boruto for a moment, before waving with a wide smile. What did I miss? Boruto glared at Shikadai. Nothing, number one big mo, he waved. Boruto. Sarada turned on her heel feeling relieved that she was able to shake Chocho's prying into her mission details. Boruto puffed his cheeks at Team Ino Shika Cho. Sarada continued to hold on to her orange flower. She followed Boruto as he eagerly took lead in meeting up with Konohamaru. As she followed him she began thinking about the Hokage again. His eyes glanced over at Boruto, and he grinned at her. His two whiskers flashed by her as he quickened his pace. She rolled her eyes. I am not racing you, Boruto. Sarada said sternly. Sure, you are. We can't keep my dad waiting either. Boruto pushed his front foot to the ground and chuckled as he crouched down into a runner's lunge. Sarada felt a pang in her stomach. The Hokage. Boruto looked over his shoulder with a playful smile on his face. Sarada smirked at Boruto. Sarada mimicked his stance, and hastily tucked the orange flower in her headband off to the side. She adjusted her glasses and let out a, hey. Oh, for the Hokage you'll race. Boruto's smile changed to a determined stare. Sarada instantly blushed at the Hokage's son's words. She turned her head and stared down the road. Always so damn dramatic, Boruto, Uzumaki. Sarada took a deep breath. She knew Boruto was right though. She could really care less about Konohamaru calling for her, or Boruto's determination to get a well-paying mission. Sarada bit the inside of her lip thinking that there was not much interest until she realized that the Hokage would be there too. Boruto and Sarada met up with Mitsuki just outside the building. He had been waiting on them for a little while now. Mitsuki could already hear them bickering about something as they approached. Both of them were trying to catch their breath. You two should stop acting so childish. This is serious. Mitsuki looked at the two of them as they walked into the building. Where is Konohamaru? Sarada looked around thinking maybe he was goofing off somewhere. Be serious. The Hokage and Shikamaru are talking with him. They were waiting on us. Whatever mission this is, we really need to take it serious. Please don't fight with each other this time. Mitsuki looked at Boruto the whole time. Hey, I am not the one that is always lecturing my teammates. Boruto looked at Sarada. Really? Sarada glared. Can we just not talk at all then? Mitsuki said dully. The Hokage let Shikamaru explain the mission and why it was so important for Team 7 to carry out the mission. Mitsuki calculated all the possible outcomes as Shikamaru explained the difficulty and preciseness of the mission. Boruto butted in asking questions without thinking first. The Hokage told his son to be quiet several times. Sarada listened to every detail. She avoided eye contact with Shikamaru and the Hokage for the majority of the meeting. She felt awkward at first being around both Boruto and Naruto at the same time. As the mission was explained, though, she found herself thinking so much about the possible mission details. Over the 10 to 15 minutes of mission explanations, Sarada finally made eye contact with the Hokage. He breathed in deeply and sat straight up in his chair as Shikamaru wrapped up the details. So, in conclusion, the reason why this mission is so important for Team 7 is because the target for retrieval is one Uchiha, Sasuke. Shikamaru looked to Konohamaru, who was behind the team. All three adults looked to Sarada for a response. The silence filled the room for a moment or two. Uchiha, it would seem that you might finally meet your father. Mitsuki looked over at Sarada. The Sasuke Uchiha. Boruto looked wide-eyed and very much interested. Sarada closed her eyes so the tears that had built up in her eyes would be forced to roll down her cheeks. She clenched her jaw tightly and took a deep breath. Her heart began to heart quickly. It felt as though she had released a huge reserve of chakra. She curled her fingers into fists at her side. She had been waiting her whole life for a chance to meet her dad, and this is how it was going to happen. It was going to happen with a paid mission. Sarada felt hurt that Naruto would even consider this to be just another mission to her and the rest of her team. She felt a sting of pain in her eyes as she opened her eyes, looking directly into Naruto's eyes. In the reflection of Naruto's bright blue eyes were deep red eyes that no one had ever seen before in Sarada's eyes. Naruto's eyes widened, and he parted his lips in surprise. Sarada narrowed her eyes at him, and she took another deep breath. Shikamaru stood up straight, bringing his hands together to prepare his shadow possession jutsu. Konohamaru was standing behind his team. Mitsuki and Boruto looked at each other, and then they both looked at Sarada. Sarada, calm down. Naruto held up a hand to her from behind his desk. Sharingan, Mitsuki said in an intrigued tone. Whoa, hey. Boruto looked at Sarada. Boruto had seen Sarada get pretty worked up and angry, but to waken her Sharingan, Boruto had no idea what to expect at this point, but he knew this had to be the emotional release of the Sharingan. Boruto noticed the way Shikamaru reacted too, which was a sign that whatever Sarada was doing could be harmful. Boruto looked at his dad. Naruto slowly stood up. Sarada, listen to me. Naruto tried to use a casual tone. He redirected his eyes from hers. He looked at Boruto. How long has that mission been sitting on your desk? Sarada's voice far from casual. It was cold and distant. Boruto looked at Sarada, almost jaw dropped to the floor. He had never known Sarada to speak to his dad like that. Naruto gulped down the sudden dryness in his throat. Since this morning, Sarada's eyes filled with tears again as she recalled the morning with the Hokage. Her tears burning as they streamed down her cheeks. Mitsuki looked at Konohamaru. Konohamaru jerked his head to tell Mitsuki to get back with him. Mitsuki moved beside his sensei and watched the change that Sarada was going through. Sarada, Shikamaru warned her. You need to calm down. Sarada reached up to her headband and pulled the flower from beneath it. Naruto looked at her and his heart dropped, seeing that Sarada had been holding on to that flower all day, and now Sarada dropped it on the floor and squished the petals beneath her shoe. Naruto's whole body collapsed in the chair as he watched the intimate bond he just made with the younger Uchiha get smashed into the ground. What the heck is going on? Boruto looked more lost than ever. Boruto, you should go with Konohamaru. We can take care of the mission details later tonight. Shikamaru advised Boruto to go. Boruto shook his head and looked at his dad. He didn't know what was going on. Why would his dad be so hesitant to take action? Is that what you and my mom were talking about this morning? Not some stupid medical ninja issues. Sarada continued questioning the Hokage without holding back. My mom is in on some secret about my dad. How come I wasn't told about this before now? Did not care enough, or what? Why do a bunch of teenagers have to go risk their lives for his sake? Boruto looked over at his dad for answers, but there were no answers being given. Boruto looked back at Sarada. Konohamaru grabbed the back of Boruto's jacket and pulled him back. Boruto fought to get free of the grip Konohamaru had on him. Boruto was the first to admit that his friendship with Sarada was a little rocky, but they were a team and they should be there for each other. Boruto turned to Konohamaru. Konohamaru shook his head seriously and dragged Boruto out of the room. Mitsuki walked behind them. He looked over at Sarada at a loss for words. He wanted to stay and see the Sharingan in action, but he followed his sensei. Shikamaru. Naruto looked over at the Shadow Ninja's hands. Can you just trust me to handle this? Are you sure? Shikamaru slowly lowered his hands. She is upset. Naruto looked up at Shikamaru. Clearly we approached this all wrong. Naruto turned his head, feeling tears form in his eyes. Shikamaru walked behind the Hokage's chair, and as he walked past the desk he turned to Naruto to be sure this is exactly what Naruto wanted. Naruto nodded, and took a deep breath, hoping the tears in his eyes were not noticeable. Sarada watched Shikamaru leave the room, and she turned her eyes back to Naruto, who had managed to stand up and hastily moved in front of the desk while Sarada was still watching Shikamaru. Naruto was amazed he moved that quickly with a Sharingan focused on him this whole time. Naruto, Sarada shook her head. Don't get any closer to me. Her eyes focused on him. I am not. Naruto held his hands up slightly. What is this all about? Why now, Naruto? Sarada took a step back, her eyes starting to lose focus. She felt so emotional about everything, all she ever wanted was answers, and she always ended up more lost with even more questions than when she started. You got to calm down first. Naruto watched her movements. No, you can't tell me to calm down now. You were supposed to help me. Sarada fell to her knees and punched her fist into the ground angrily. Naruto felt the ground vibrate with her punch. He saw the Sakura in her showing, and he knew he really had to be careful. He could still recall how painful Sakura's punches were. He didn't doubt Sarada's strength. How long have you known that we would have to go find my dad? Sarada stared at the ground with her fist still firmly planted in the ground. Sarada, stop. Naruto spoke firmly. Tell me. Sarada punched the ground with her other fist. Since the day I left with the shadow clone, that's why you couldn't go yourself. Sarada tightened her fists again and glared at the ground, waiting for Naruto to give her answers. She felt her life losing control. When an hour ago she was starting to feel things coming together. She felt wanted by someone who understood the feeling of not having a father. She felt like she had control of her anger and hate towards her life missing a father figure. She clenched her jaw tightly, thinking about the picture of the old Team 7 hanging in her mom's house. She wished she was at home right now. She would punch that picture so hard the glass would shatter, and the picture would fall to the ground. Sarada gulped down the anger that was bubbling up to the surface. Naruto hated that this had went the way it did. If he could take it back he would, but he knew there was no way to undo the hurt he has caused her. He stood up slowly, turning his back to her, and sighing. He knew being in that position was never a good thing when dealing with an Uchiha's Sharingan. What else could he do though? She demanded answers and he couldn't look into her pain-filled eyes, especially knowing he was the one that had hurt her so deeply. He walked to the window overlooking the Leaf Village. He placed an open palm on the window pane as he thought of what words he should use to explain his foolish decisions. Naruto was no stranger to acting foolish, making dumb decisions, and flat out not thinking plans through. He stared down at the village he had worked so hard to be the Hokage of. He let out a groan of disappointed. Sarada, Naruto wanted to choose his words carefully. There are some things I should tell you. So, tell me. Sarada looked coldly at the desk of the Hokages. She could not even bring herself to look at him. First, do not drag Sakura into this. She only knows that we received a message from Suigetsu. Naruto tapped his index and middle finger on the window. A friend of your father's. Naruto was not sure if Sarada would even understand how difficult and delicate this sort of situation will turn out to be. Things were different now. People seemed to forget how hard others fought for the Leaf Village. People had forgotten how much was lost in saving this world. He thought for a short moment about Shikamaru's dad, Ino's dad, Uncle Neji. His heart sank. He looked over his shoulder at Sarada. Your dad's a rare breed of shinobi. He not only possesses a Sharingan, but also a Rinnegan. These are two of the three main dojutsus. The third being the Hyuga clan's Byakugan. Visual prowess is desired in the shinobi world. It might not be as strong now as it was when your father and I were young, but there are still sects of shinobi in this world determined to obtain others' prowess in the cruelest ways imaginable. Naruto looked back out the window at his village. Your father has been out hunting those who use and abuse their powers to obtain shinobi prowess. Whether it was visual or any other form of sensory prowess. He was determined to put an end to it. On his search he managed to send a message to his friend to inform us that, somehow, he had got caught. Captured. I cannot imagine how someone like your father had managed that. The Rinnegan and Sharingan are no match for most shinobi no matter how hard they train for it. Suigetsu wanted it to be clear that Sasuke had managed to be captured and wanted us to made aware until such a time that Sasuke could not handle the situation on his own. I know how your father is. He would not want my help, not unless there was no other way. He would not have went through the trouble of telling Suigetsu anything unless he knew it would get to that point. The intel that Shikamaru shared about this mission is everything that Suigetsu and the other two of your father's friends could gather on the shinobi that had managed to capture him. Naruto's voice fell silent. He thought about his best friend being in trouble right now. He thought about how the Uchiha family is broken up and pulled in different directions, much as the clan was when they were alive. How long have you known, Naruto? Sarada emphasized his name with insolence. Don't say my name like that. He turned to her, and she was staring coldly out the window. Sarada's eyes shifted to look harshly at Naruto. He felt his eyes burning. He had forgotten how easily his emotions could blind him from his better judgment. He forgot his eyes were prone to tears and his heart prone to aching. He stepped toward his desk. He wanted to get closer to her but knew she would only push him further away. He leaned on the side of his desk and stared at the door to his office. He hated this so much, but he knew there had to be a way to make it right. Naruto, she repeated his name in the same tone as before. Mocking last request. She stood up on her feet and made her hands into fists again. Naruto did not look at her but knew by the sound of her movement she was standing. He crossed his arms and closed his eyes with a heavy sigh. He hated hearing his name like that. It reminded him of being that young orphan boy that no one wanted, that no one loved, that no one cared about. The tears in his eyes clung to the corner of his eyelids. He could not bring himself to tell Sarada that he had known since before this morning, but something told him that she already knew. She wanted to hear him say it. Well, Sarada huffed, staring now at Naruto. You already know the answer, don't you? Naruto turned his head to her, and as he opened his eyes the tears that clung to the corners of his eyelids fell down his cheeks. He lowered his head, and as he did he saw the flower smashed on the ground, and he sniffled, bringing a hand to his face and wiping his eyes. Sarada turned her back away from the Hokage and walked to the door. She placed her hand on the door knob and slowly turned it. As she turned the door knob she took a deep breath, trying to calm herself down. She had never felt so angry and hurt as she did right now. The worst thing about it was that she could not talk to anyone about it. She glanced over her shoulder at Naruto, who was watching her. His blue eyes darker than normal, and she blinked several times as she started losing focus again. She pulled the door open. I will report to Konohamaru-sensei for this mission. You better think of something clever to tell your son. Her tone matching the way she said his name moments ago, when saying, your son. Sarada left the room and pulled the door shut. As she walked down the hall she felt faint. Her vision blurred, and her hands shaky. She placed a hand on the wall to brace herself. As she closed her eyes she felt her knees buckle. Sarada was weak, and she could not even catch herself from collapsing on the ground. Just as she fell to the ground, a wisp of black and red swooped in and caught her body from meeting the ground. Sarada felt arms holding her tightly, and a faint familiar voice whispering. It's okay Sarada, I got you, you need to rest. Sarada inhaled deeply as she started to wake from what felt like a long nap. She held a pillow close to her chest, her chin tucked into the pillow, lips pressed against the pillow and nose taking in the scent of the material. She recognized that scent, it felt very familiar, but she could not think of what was so familiar about it. Sarada felt warm, comfortable, and safe curled up beneath these covers, holding on to this pillow. She squinted her eyes looking around at the dimmed room. The lights were off in the room, but the curtains drawn provided the setting sun's natural light. Sarada couldn't really make out much of what was in the room aside from it being a peer's room. She could only tell that by the size of the bed, and the decor of the room. She could see some posters on the wall, but not really make out what was on them. Sarada lifted her chin to look around the room a little more as she tried to figure out where she was. Sarada realized she did not have her glasses either. She reached around on the bed to see and they maybe were just laying around on the bed. She groaned at the absence of her glasses, the unknown room she was in, and the ache in her heart as she realized what led up to being in this situation. She rubbed her eyes sleepily and sat up. She could tell by the sunsetting she must have been asleep for a couple hours at least. Sitting up, Sarada looked a little harder around the room to figure where she was. The room felt comfortable and welcoming, and the scent of the pillow was something Sarada could recall being around frequently. She stood up and walked to the bookshelf and looked at the books, squinting harder to figure out the book titles, but it was no use in this lighting. Sarada turned to the small desk and smirked, seeing a couple picture frames and thinking yes. Sarada reached over and took one of the pictures into her hands. She turned the frame to her and stared down. She whimpered, upset at what she discovered. Looking down, she saw two whisker-faced blondes, both smiling irritatingly up at her. She pushed the picture frame face down on the desk and groaned with misery. She rolled her eyes and walked to the window. How the hell did I end up in the Uzumaki house? What the heck am I going to do now? Who brought me here? Wait, is this Boruto's room? Was I just cuddling with his pillow? What the heck? Oh man, I hope he didn't see me sleeping, this is no good. I can't be here, her mind raced as she looked out the window. She stared wide-eyed, lost in her thoughts running through her mind. Her stomach felt queasy thinking about everything that had happened 24 hours. Sarada lowered her head and felt her heart sink deep into her stomach as she realized everything she had to face. She felt more lost, hurt, and alone than ever. Sarada walked back to the desk and sat down at the chair. She brought her feet into the chair and wrapped her arms around her knees. She put her head down on her arms. She began to wonder if maybe she did hit her head somehow. Knock. Knock. Sarada. The polite warm voice of Hinata called to the young Uchiha. Sarada felt like she would throw up if she picked up her head. She did not say anything. She didn't know if she could handle looking into Hinata's eyes right now. The door knob turned and the door cracked open. Hinata looked around inside for a moment. She came into the room seeing that Sarada was up out of the bed. Hinata walked to the desk and Sarada heard her put something down on it. Sarada buried her face deeper in her arms. Her ears were burning from immense embarrassment, awkwardness, hurt, and anger. She never gave thought in having to look into Naruto's wife's eyes until now. She sniffled and tears started escaping her eyes. She didn't want to look up no matter what. Now, Hinata said, comforting. Boruto told me what happened in the Hokage's office. Oh, Sarada. Boruto's voice made Sarada's ears perk. You are awake. Man, we were getting worried. Hima, she wanted to stay in bed with you the whole time until you woke up. Boruto stood beside his mom with the same nervous stance as his dad, one hand behind his neck scratching nervously. Sarada could not bring herself to say anything. She let her legs slowly fall to the floor, and she leaned over the desk, still hiding her face in her arms. Hinata looked at Boruto. They both exchanged looks. Boruto told his mom he wanted to talk to her teammate to teammate. Hinata made a confused face at her son. There were times that Hinata found it hard to believe she son had matured enough to take things maturely and seriously. She nodded after a minute of thinking. She walked out of the room, and slowly pulled the door closed. Sarada sat in silence and waited for Boruto to say something. She gulped down the bad taste the tears left in her mouth and lifted her head to wipe her face with her hands. She couldn't think of anything to say even still. She looked up at the other picture frames. One of them had a picture of Boruto hugging his mom's stomach and smiling happily. The other was a family picture of the Uzumakis. Sarada groaned. She was growing more and more impatient by the silence, and the awkwardness of sitting in the Uzumaki's house. So, Sharingan. Boruto let out a hey and smiled at his teammate as he sat down on his bed. Sarada rolled her eyes at Boruto's conversation starting skills. Sarada sighed and slowly spun around in Boruto's chair. She stopped the chair with her body was facing Boruto. Sarada's eyes looked to the floor. Are you okay? Boruto's tone more comforting, and serious now. I mean, that was intense. Dad must not have thought that through. Boruto sighed. He never really does he? Boruto looked at Sarada. She looked so gloomy. If he upset you by springing that mission on us out of nowhere, we all understand. It is Sasuke Uchiha. That is your dad. My dad could have at least talked to you about it before. Boruto thought for a moment. Wasn't he at your house this morning anyways? Boruto made a confused face and turned his head to look out his window trying to figure out his dad's mess. Sarada looked up at Boruto stunned that he knew what his dad was up to. She felt a chill on her arms, and her face looked flush. She felt nervous knowing it would only be a matter of moments before Boruto asked her questions, and for once they might be justified, and not moronic. She lowered her eyes again. You would think if he was there he would make a little more of an effort to include you. He talked to your mom about it, Boruto started thinking out loud. Sarada shifted in the chair, and bit her lip listening to Boruto talk out loud. She always wondered how Boruto knew the Hokage's business. Then again you had just come off a mission, maybe you weren't awake. Boruto looked over at Sarada waiting on a reply. Sarada continued biting her lip. A moment passed and Sarada did not reply or even look up to acknowledge he was waiting on a reply. Boruto let out another hey and leaned back on his bed with his hands behind his head. He stared up at the ceiling. Sarada looked up at Boruto. She could tell he thought a lot about his dad's actions. You really are the number one big mouth ninja, Boruto, Sarada said in a quiet voice. Boruto lifted his head and looked at Sarada. They both exchanged a small smirk at each other. Boruto laid his head back down. Sarada stood up and walked to the bed and sat beside Boruto. She turned her head to look down at him. He glanced at her. Really though Sarada, are you okay? We don't see eye to eye most of the time, but we are a team, and what is a team if we cannot support each other when we need it the most? Sarada turned her head to look down in her lap. Boruto looked up at the ceiling again. They both didn't say anything for a minute. Sarada didn't even know what to say. She was not okay, but she didn't want to tell Boruto that because he would pry and pry. She couldn't lie either, because she knew in her heart there was no way she could sound convincing enough to pull it off. Sarada glanced over at Boruto again. She wondered if he was trying to play all relaxed to make her feel more comfortable. She seemed to always be irritated by his uppity personality, his talkative tendencies, and the way he could not just stay still for a minute, and yet in this moment he was extremely calm. Sarada felt like she could actually connect with him without fighting over something. She felt as if Boruto had grown up a little. Sarada sighed. Honestly Boruto, I am not okay, I cannot think straight, I feel lost, hurt, and so many other feelings. Boruto looked at her again. Both their eyes met. Yeah, he said in a quiet voice. Sarada, you know you can stay for dinner if you want and maybe take your mind off things for a while until we meet with Konohamaru later. Dinner. Sarada said, distracted from her thoughts of her heart. Yeah, Himawari's idea actually. Boruto made a confused face at Sarada's tone. Dinner? Boruto, I can't. Sarada stood up and half laughed. I am supposed to be meeting my mom for dinner. I completely forgot. Oh, Boruto sat up. Okay. Hey, you mind if I walk with you there? Boruto smiled. Well, I guess it would be alright. Sarada shrugged and gave him a smirk. Yeah, Boruto grinned and stood up. He held out his hand to help Sarada up on her feet. Sarada reached out and took his hand. She got to her feet a second later, and Boruto dashed to his desk and grabbed a small neatly folded fabric that his mom placed on the desk earlier. Boruto handed it to Sarada and pointed to his forehead. Sarada looked down, and found it was her headband with her glasses wrapped safely inside the material. Sarada smiled, happy to see her glasses were scratch-free. She tucked her headband in her back pocket and put her glasses on. She blinked a couple times to let her eyes adjust. Thanks, Boruto. They both left his room and walked into the living area of the home. Himawari ran to Sarada and gave her a hug. Sarada hugged her back, but less enthusiastic than Himawari's hug was. Himawari pulled out of the hug and grinned. Sarada smirked and didn't bring herself to look into Himawari's eyes. Hinata poked her head out of the kitchen and smiled warmly at her son. Boruto grinned back at her. I know dinner will be ready soon, but I wanted to walk with Sarada to make sure she made it to her mom, is that okay? I won't get distracted. I will come straight home after. Boruto leaned against the hallway wall across from the kitchen. Okay. Make sure you come home, just in case your dad comes by. Boruto gave him mom a yeah right look on his face. Sure. Okay. Boruto kissed his mom on the cheek and bowed his head to thank her and turned to go to the door. Himawari looked disappointed to see Sarada leave so soon. Boruto patted her on the head and grinned. Sarada waved to Himawari and followed her teammate out the door. Boruto, where are you going? The Hokage's voice came from just outside the yard. Sarada's heart stopped, and she looked at the Hokage. Boruto gave his dad a dirty look and jerked his head to Sarada. The Hokage looked over at Sarada. Sarada's eyes quickly shifted to Boruto. Helping her. The Hokage stood aside at the path leading to his home. He watched Boruto walk past him looking like his usual self, irritable and grumpy at his old man. He looked at Sarada and hoped she would look at him, but she kept her eyes focused on the younger Uzumaki walking beside her. I will be back, don't worry, maybe your jutsu will release before then. Boruto waved a hand over his head. Sarada looked straight ahead now. She noticed how much Boruto's attitude and mood changed. Sarada thought about all the complaining Boruto has done about his dad. She sighed. She wanted to look back to see the Hokage's reaction to her lack of interest in his presence, but her better judgment told her to keep on going. At the corner, Boruto looked at Sarada. So where are you meeting your mom? Boruto looked around to see what direction he should take. Ramen, Sarada said sadly. Damn, Boruto shook his head. You are telling me. Whose idea was that? Boruto's tone sounded snobby. Mine, Sarada sighed. What the hell? Boruto laughed. Well, at the time it was the first thing that came to mind. Sarada half laughed. Ichiraku's it is. Poor you. You should have stayed over for dinner. Boruto grinned and gave Sarada a thumb up. The walk to Ichiraku's was a pleasant walk to say the least. Both Sarada and Boruto talked for once without feeling like they were both going to punch one another. They laughed, talking casually, and the way Boruto made silly impressions of his peers. Sarada felt at ease, and even more so like she had made a new friend. Sure, she had known Boruto for forever, but she and him never really ever listened to one another. Their past conversations were more like them both stating their opinions, then instantly arguing over who was right and who was wrong, and who needed to get beaten up for being annoying. Sarada for a moment even felt a little happy. It was strange to have her heart crushed just a couple hours ago, and not she was smiling and felt a little warmth in her heart. It wasn't the kind of warmth she felt this very morning, but the kind of warmth you get when a friend acknowledges you, when a friend shares a joke with you, the kind of warmth you get when your friend remembers it is your birthday and no one else did, and so that friend went out of their way to make sure you had a cake, gift, and balloons. Yeah, maybe Boruto is that kind of friend, she thought as she and Boruto approached Ichiraku's. As they both walked up to Ichiraku's, Sarada spotted her mom instantly sitting at a table set for two. Sarada turned to Boruto. She had never felt such a strong connection with Boruto like she felt right now at this moment. She smiled looking into his eyes. She shook her head as her smile turned more into a smirk. What? Boruto raised an eyebrow. I don't think you and I have ever walked someplace without arguing at one another. Sarada held up a hand to Boruto. Boruto shook his head jokingly and held a fist out to her. Sarada looked down to see his gesture. She felt surprised but mimicked his gesture. They lightly bumped their knuckles against each other's. We are a team. Boruto grinned. Bye Boruto. Sarada waved and turned her back, taking a couple steps. She turned to him and grinned. And thanks. See you in a little bit. Boruto slouched with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes half-lidded, and made a relaxed smile. Sarada knew instantly that Boruto was still impersonating someone. She shook her head grinning. Boruto turned around and fixed his posture to his usual self. He raised a fist up over his head.